Welcome to Star Wars Comics in Canon. The Force is strong with this one.
Hello there and welcome to Star Wars Comics in Canon, your guide to the wider Star Wars canon through the comic book lens. And to take you on this journey, I'm your host, Mike Burton. And it is time for another book review. So my friends, this week I'm doing another book review of yet another High Republic book. It's becoming very much a common theme because I've decided to make sure my standard book reviews that are non-High Republic related go over to my Patreon. I'll give more information on that, but if you want to become a Patreon supporter for only £1 a month, then you get access to hours and hours of additional content, both of myself and Megan reviewing stuff, and also certain things that just I review solo, including the books Last Shot, Dark Disciple, and the Legends books, Shatterpoint, and Darth Plagueis, with plenty of more to come. But the next in line for the book reviews of the High Republic era in the release order is Out of the Shadows by Justina Ireland. So this book takes place in the first phase and the second wave of the High Republic era. So the first phase, first wave, that's Light of the Jedi, A Test of Courage, and Into the Dark. The second wave is The Rising Storm, Race to Crashpoint Tower, and Out of the Shadows. And then the third wave, which has just come out, is Fallen Star, Midnight Horizon, and Mission to Disaster. Now I'll be tackling those third wave things shortly. I'm just currently reading through The Fallen Star. I'm nearly at the end of it, but I want to make sure all the content I release on Star Wars Comics in Canon are within the relevant High Republic phases, just so if you are solely listening along and you're not reading any of the comics or books yourself, then you can still have a good grasp on the chronological orderings of what's going on in the galaxy far, far away of this era. So a few things before I get started. The way I structure these book reviews is I keep it spoiler free to begin with. I give my thoughts, I read out the crawl and the blurb, I talk about themes and a few bits and pieces of how it connects to other characters and other content and whatnot without bringing any spoilers. I then do some minor spoilers, like a vague amount of information on normally what happens in the first few chapters of the book, and some more in-depth thoughts on the themes and generally going into the characters a little bit more. And then at the end I give plenty of spoiler warnings and I just go through a abridged version of the plot, just giving people sort of bullet point details of what this book contains, because I appreciate that not everyone can read every piece of High Republic content, and the point of this channel is to be a guide and an addition for people who have consumed this content, but also serve as a sort of placeholder for those who haven't yet or don't plan to consume this content specifically, but still wish to have a good understanding of the Star Wars universe at this time. So that's what I'm going to be doing on this, but before I delve into any of those details, I'm going to talk about Justina Ireland quickly. She's obviously a brilliant author and a very interesting individual, but specifically I'm going to talk about her other releases, and I've listed them in the description as well, so, always check out the show notes. I put plenty of information down there. But Justina Ireland, her first High Republic release was the junior novel, A Test of Courage, and I reviewed that in August 2021. It really surprised me how good that was. She has also co-written the Edge of Balance manga, and there are 2 volumes of that out at the moment, or as of recording this. I'm waiting for my second volume to be delivered to me. And then I'll read that and then work out where it best fits in the timeline, and then I'll release an episode reviewing that and going through those usual details. And she's also written Mission to Disaster, which is the junior novel from Phase 1, Wave 3. So that'll be in 2 book reviews time that I tackle that. And then non-High Republic books that she's written that are still Star Wars. She's written the book Lando's Luck, Spark of the Resistance, and she also wrote the one-shot comic, which is in the big War of the Bounty Hunters crossover event that I tackled, and she did the Jabba the Hutt 1 comic. So details about Out of the Shadows. So it is a YA novel, a young adult novel. With the YA novels thus far in this first wave, what it seems to be is that the adult novel and the junior novel take place at the same time, usually at slightly different perspectives of a galactic event that's going on. And then the young adult novels seem to take place usually a few weeks after, maybe a month or 2 after the events of those prior 2 books, to kind of serve as an extended epilogue. So I kind of view it as the adult books are the main pillars. They are the most important plot details for the High Republic era for each wave of them. The junior novels add additional information to them, additional perspectives, but also serve as a placeholder for those younger readers who may not be able to read a 450-page adult book, or if some of the themes are a bit too strong. So the junior novel gives you an abridged idea of what the events were in the adult novel, but also giving a lot of added value to some more interesting characters and other perspectives, so you still get a good understanding there. And then the young adult novel comes in afterwards to kind of be like, what happened after these events that you just heard about occurred, and what happens to the galaxy from that point for a little bit. That's generally how it kind of goes. It's very much me giving you like a really broad understanding of how I interpret how each of these books work, but they are all definitely worth a read, although I appreciate not everyone has time to read all those books as well as every other piece of content that you guys are no doubt consuming, both Star Wars related and non-Star Wars related. But Out of the Shadows came out July 27th, 2021. It is in the time frame of 231 years before the Battle of Yavin, so that means they take place still in the second wave of the first phase of the High Republic, which is about a year after the events of Light of the Jedi. Now, although I generally recommend people do read as much High Republic content as possible because it's all really, really good. I haven't read anything that's bad as of yet. The mini-series, the ongoing series of comics, the books, all of it is just ace. I'm thoroughly enjoying it. But recommended reading from me, or if you haven't read any of the other content, please check out my reviews of, because it will give some information, would be the book Into the Dark, which is a young adult novel from the previous wave, and then also the junior novel A Test of Courage, which obviously was also written by Justina Ireland. Now, I specifically highlight A Test of Courage and Into the Dark because there are characters in this book that were featured in those books as well. So this, to me, kind of serves as a spiritual successor to those two books kind of coming together. I feel like they work really well as a trilogy, and really, really enjoyable read. And as I said, if you haven't gone back and listened to my reviews of those, but you also haven't read the books themselves, please go back and check those out. Test of Courage was out August 2021, and Into the Dark was out October 2021. If you're on my YouTube channel, you can check out under the book reviews section, or in the High Republic section, or if you're listening in a podcaster app on the feed of Comics in Motion, you should just be able to type in the words A Test of Courage book review or Into the Dark book review. Then it should come up quite high up on the search results. So let's begin with my completely spoiler-free thoughts. I'm not going to tackle any information about the book itself. I'm just going to give my thoughts on it, and then I'll give you guys a bit of warning. Then I'll go into my mildly spoiler review, and I'll read the blurb and the crawl, and then we'll kind of go from there. So my thoughts on this book. I thought this was a brilliant book, as per all High Republic content I have served thus far. I think that compared to Into the Dark, which is the other YA novel, I think they're both pretty even for different reasons. I think Into the Dark and Out of the Shadows both had a bit of a lull in the middle. I think Into the Dark has a much more clear story and clear antagonists and where the plot is kind of going throughout, whereas I found that Out of the Shadows, there were certain points where I wasn't entirely sure who the antagonist was, if anyone, where the plot was kind of going. I felt like halfway through the book, I was just like, I don't really know. Like, I know what the characters are going to go and do, but I didn't really know how that would impact the rest of the Star Wars universe or how it would affect the characters, really. I was a bit unsure of that. And although I did enjoy it, and I think the characters are definitely the highlight of this book, I do think that this is a slightly weaker entry into the High Republic than Into the Dark. And I would say that still at the moment, my favourite releases from the High Republic books are still the two pillar books of The Rising Storm and Light of the Jedi, closely followed by the junior novels, A Test of Courage and Race to Crashpoint Tower, and then probably the young adult novels Into the Dark and Out of the Shadows. But I don't want that to prevent anyone from picking up these books because they are really good, and there are a couple of characters in this novel in particular that I'm really, really into, and also because there are a couple of returning characters from previous novels as well, it does give a bit of closure, and I like seeing certain characters grow. Obviously, with it being a young adult novel, it means that the majority of the characters whose journeys you see are around teenage years / young adults. That is often a common theme in young adult novels, is that the central characters, the main protagonists, are often young adults themselves, and it's some degree of coming of age story, you know, finding yourself, trying to figure out where your place is in the galaxy. Those sort of themes are definitely reoccurring in young adult Star Wars novels at least, and this one is no different in that regard either. Now, interestingly, although I think the plot is one of the weaker of the High Republic novels, I think that the lore is actually some of the strongest. Now, obviously, Light of the Jedi and The Rising Storm bring forward major plot points of how the galaxy is affected by things, but I think that Out of the Shadows does a really good job of explaining hyperspace a bit more, and it's something I'll delve into and I'll give you guys more information of when I get into the slightly more spoiler-y discussion on this. But because of some of the central themes, characters, and even corporations involved in this book, I do think it gives a lot of intriguing information about hyperspace, which we didn't know about prior. Obviously, Legends has got lots of information about that sort of thing, but in the current canon, there's not really much about hyperspace. It's just, for ages, it was just, you can do hyperspace, and then you obviously need your nav computer or an astromech or something to do the calculations of how to get you through hyperspace. And then in Solo, a Star Wars story, it introduced coaxium, which is a hyperspace fuel, showing that to use hyperspace, you needed a degree of fuel with it and a specific engine and things. I know obviously the hyperdrive is something that I think was even mentioned in the original trilogy, but I do not believe in Legends, to my recollection, there was explicitly a hyperspace fuel, and there definitely wasn't one in canon. So there is one obviously now. So just as the canon continues to unfold back in the time of the Skywalker saga, but also in the High Republic era, we're just learning a lot more about hyperspace, which I really appreciate. It's one of those things about the lore of Star Wars, of it being a space fantasy or a sci-fi genred franchise, that I really enjoy. I just love learning about the lore of the entire universe. So that is definitely one of the strongest parts of this that I thought was interesting. I do quite like the degree of social commentary where you've got certain corporations in this and kind of being able to do what they want, and it's got certain characters within the book questioning why they can do these things, and oh my god, look how, the top 0.1% live, because there's a point where they go into some incredibly rich person's one of the places that they can live, and all the characters just like blown away, especially some of the Jedi characters, where it's just like, how do people live like this? Because it's just so luxurious to excess. And I think all of us have probably seen pictures in the real world of, say, the 7-star hotel in Dubai, or some of the places that you can rent on Airbnb when you put up the pricing to be as high as conceivably possible, and you can rent some of those properties for like thousands of pounds a night, and you look at it and go, yeah, that's ridiculously excessive, there's no need for that. It's those kind of things that us, in air quotes, normal people couldn't even imagine living in those things. And those are reoccurring themes that do pop up, kind of how the rich can get away with a lot of things, which I appreciate. I know that Justina Ireland on social media has been quite vocal about certain political leanings of hers, which I haven't got a problem with. And so I think that marries up quite well, because, Star Wars has always been political, and it does always have its foot in the door in space fantasy and social commentary politics. It just depends on who's at the helm as to what degree of each of those themes are put forward. And I think that Justina Ireland in this book definitely has a lot of good social commentary that works, that there is stuff for that in Star Wars anyway, but I especially like its appearance here. So yeah, my final spoiler-free thoughts are just that it's a really enjoyable book. The characters are very strong. Some of the lore notes that I took down about hyperspace are really, really good as well. But the plot itself is a little bit ploddy, I think. I don't think it quite moves along quick enough or gives a clear enough indication of what actually happens. And when I finished the book, I was like, okay, well, I'm interested by XYZ, but the main plot was probably the thing that intrigued me the least, which seems to be quite different from how the adult novels of the High Republic have been acting. But then again, with Into the Dark, I did find that somewhat. I found it was more about the characters and their journeys, more so than the plot itself. But that maybe other people have interpreted that differently. If you guys have read these books as well, I would be very interested to hear what people's thoughts are. And I want to clarify, I don't think the plot in this is bad. I think it's just one of its weaker elements. So with that in mind, let's get into the minor spoiler review now. So I'm going to read out the blurb as well as the crawl of this book, and then I'm going to talk a little bit more about the themes and the characters themselves that reappear. And I don't class those as spoilers in particular, because if you read the first 2 or 3 chapters of this book, all of the characters that I'm going to name do get brought up. So it's not like you're reading through it and then I ruin something that happened in the last chapter or 2. I will, as I said, give you guys plenty of warning before I give the final piece of this review, which is going to be more spoilery details and just general bullet points of what the plot is. But let's get into the other details first. So here is the blurb of the book. Silvestri Yarrow is having a streak of bad luck with no end in sight. She's been doing her best to keep the family cargo business going after her mum's death, but between mounting debt and increasing attacks by the Nile on unsuspecting ships, Sil is in danger of losing all that she has left of her mother. She heads to the galactic capital of Coruscant for help, but gets sidetracked when she's drawn into a squabble between 2 of the Republic's most powerful families over a patch of space on the frontier. Knee-deep in rich people's problems is the last place Sil wants to be, but the promise of a big payoff is enough to keep her interested. Meanwhile, Jedi Knight Vernestra Rwoh has been summoned to Coruscant, but with no idea why or by whom. She and her Padawan, Imri, arrive at the capital along with Jedi Master Comac Vitus and his Padawan, Reeth, and are asked to assist with the familial dispute on the frontier. But why? What is so important about an empty patch of space? The answer will lead Vernestra to a new understanding of her abilities and take Syl back to the past, and to truths that will finally come out of the shadows. So obviously that in itself shows there are generally two storylines going on at once. One is Sylvester Yarrow's and her trying to work out where she fits into the universe, and the other one is with Vernestra Rwoh, who's introduced in A Test of Courage with her Padawan Imri Kantaros, and then also you've got Reith Silas and his master Comac Vitus, and they are the main characters in Into the Dark. So all of these characters do eventually meet up and end up going on the adventure together, but for the first portion of the book you do hear it from each of their separate perspectives, and they get to Coruscant in the first quarter, maybe the first third of the book or so, and it kind of unfolds from there. So that was obviously the blurb, so now here is the crawl. The galaxy celebrates. With the dark days of the hyperspace disaster behind them, Chancellor Lina So pushes ahead with the latest of her great works. The Republic Fair will be her finest hour, a celebration of peace, unity, and hope on the frontier world of Allo. But an insatiable horror appears on the horizon. One by one, planets fall as the carnivorous Drengir consume all life in their path. As Jedi Master Avar Kriss leads the battle against this terror, Nihil forces gather in secret for the next stage of Marchion Ro's diabolical plan. Only the noble Jedi Knights stand in Ro's way, but even the protectors of light and life are not prepared for the terrible darkness that lies ahead. So that crawl in itself does not give you even the remotest piece of information about this book, because I'm fairly certain that this is actually exactly the same as what the crawl is for the other two High Republic books in the first wave and second phase of the High Republic, because I'm fairly certain I read this out before, and from what I remember, I don't think the Drengir even appear in this book at all. In fact, the Republic Fair, they don't go near the Republic Fair either. I'm fairly certain you hear about what happened to the Republic Fair like partway through this book, so yeah, the crawl is not overly helpful of what the actual plot is going to be. The blurb does a much better job of that. But obviously what the blurb does do quite well is set the scene for what is going on with the main characters. You've got Sylvester Yarrow, who is the main character, I'd say. Vernestra Rwoh is probably the other main character, but this story is centering around Sylvester Yarrow, and she is front and center on the cover of this book. And it is confirmed that her mum gets killed by some Nihil, she's left with her ship, which is also her home, and she's trying to make her way in the universe with the bare stuff that she has. And like many of the individuals that are in lots of coming-of-age stories and movies and things, you've got someone who's in it for themselves, they get offered an exorbitant amount of money, and when they pursue this money, then things start to fall apart around them, and then they usually learn the lesson along the way that money wasn't the most important thing. Now, I'm not saying that does or doesn't happen in the story, I'm just saying that is quite a common thread. But this story is a lot about sort of conspiracies and, being lied to and manipulation and, rich people being intertwined with all of those sort of dealings. So with that in mind, I thought I'd go through some of the characters first that are featuring in this book to give a bit of background information. Then I'll give a little bit more spoilery opinions on the book itself. And then I'll, finish everything off by just running through the general plot. So as I was already kind of talking about Sylvester Yarrow, I will start with her. So I view this book as Sylvester Yarrow's journey and then added information about the characters around her. She's definitely the central character. So as I said, it starts off by giving you the information that her mum was killed by the Nihil and that she's just left with her ship, which is also her home. Then in the first chapter or two, she then gets this ship stolen, which starts off this whole adventure. So she has got a crew, she's got a couple of people she does rely on, but to go on this adventure, she needs to leave them behind somewhere. And it's not in a horrible way or anything like that. They're in communication throughout the book, but it's a journey for her. Now, she gets into contact with someone called Zylan Graf, who is a member of one of the big hyperspace families. So the two main hyperspace families are the Grafs, and the other ones are the Santekers. So Santeker is a surname you may remember from The Force Awakens, because the old dude at the start of The Force Awakens who Poe finds, he is Lord Santeker. And then Grafs, their name is actually mentioned in the Star Wars Adventures comics. I think it's Adventures in Wild Space, and also in the Tales to Vader's Castle. Those have got a character in it, and the character's surname is Graf, so they are like a descendant of the Graf family. So she basically goes on this adventure after meeting Zylan Graf, and it's kind of her story from there and her journey, trying to find her way in the universe, work out what people's intentions are, why people do certain things, and she's trying to put a value on getting back her own ship. That's kind of her whole mission, in a sense, is just trying to get back to where she was at the start of the book, have her ship, be able to do jobs with her crew, and be able to live comfortably in some ways. That's like really broad strokes of Sylvester. Now, she's a very intelligent character. She is also a very suspicious character in the way that she does not trust people easily. Probably because, obviously her mum got killed and all kinds of other things like that. So one thing I really like about her character, and this is one of the things that from all the Star Wars books I've read thus far, they are in this style where it's not first person, it's third person, but you get to hear what the character's thoughts are. So it follows a specific character around usually per chapter, but it's kind of almost like halfway between first and third person. It's not second person to my knowledge because that's a different kettle of fish, but I really like that because you get to hear people's inner thoughts. And when a character says a certain thing, then you hear like Silvestri think something about that. And then the next chapter, it'll have like a Vernestra Rwoh talking, for example. And then you'll hear the same character say the same thing. And then you'll hear what Vernestra Rwoh thought about that sort of thing. It's not quite that simple, but that's a good way to kind of visualize it in a way. And because Silvestri is very suspect of a lot of people, when she starts interacting with the richer characters like Xylan Graf and also the more enlightened characters like Vernestra Rwoh, Imri, Reith, the Jedi, it gives a very good insight into what the rest of the universe kind of view the Jedi as, because us as the viewers of either High Republic content or the Skywalker saga or any of those things, the Jedi are always held in quite high regard. Most people, when they watch Star Wars, especially as kids, would love to be a Jedi, and they've, got this power, but they're morally good and all these things. But for the standard person in the universe who comes across Jedi, I'm always very intrigued to hear their thoughts on what the Jedi are like. And there's always those sort of questions, and I think Silvestri does raise this sort of thing of just like, why are you Jedi here doing this mission? And that's the mission I'll get more into when I get into the spoilery stuff. But it's like, why are you Jedi here on this mission? Why are you not out finding the Nile after what they did in the emergencies and the Great Disaster, and then what they did at the Republic Fair? Why are you here with me? Why aren't you going off and fighting them, saving people? And that's part of her being at the moment, because where she lost her mum, she is now looking for people to blame. And obviously she's looking to blame the Nile, but it's not quite that simple. So she's blaming other people who she doesn't believe acted in the right way. So that's a very interesting part of Silvestri's character, trying to kind of learn to push through certain prejudices she may have against either wealthy people or Jedi, say religious people, that sort of idea. And I really like that line of thinking, and I think it makes Silvestri a very balanced character, and one who I'm very intrigued by and I would love to see in future Star Wars content. So then we move on to Vernestra Rwoh. So she was introduced in A Test of Courage, and this is now going to be minor spoilers for A Test of Courage, but as I said, I've done the book review on that. I would recommend going back and checking that out because it really surprised me how good that book was. But Vernestra Rwoh, she is the youngest Padawan to become a Jedi in centuries, I think they said, in like generations. I believe she became a Jedi Knight when she was 15. Then I think when you're introduced to her in A Test of Courage, she is 16. And then I think in this book, Out of the Shadows, she's about 17. And she has a Padawan now, Imri Kantaros. And she didn't choose to have him specifically. It kind of fell into place after the events of A Test of Courage. And it's really interesting because whenever Vernestra is in it, it's always really interesting hearing sort of her internal struggles, because she's held up as such a high regarded Jedi because she's, not quite the level that Anakin was, the chosen one sort of thing, but she is held in very high regard for the accomplishments that she's made. And when she interacts with characters like Reith Silas and other Padawans that are basically her age, but obviously she's a Jedi Knight, there's always that little bit of resistance between them. There's a degree of tension. And when I talk about Reith in a moment, then I'll get into that there as well. But when Vern has interacted with other people like, I believe in the High Republic Adventures comics, I think it's in there. Or no, I think it's Race to Crashpoint Tower. So both of them have a character, Lula Talasola, who's a really interesting character as well. She has an internal monologue, I believe, in Race to Crashpoint Tower, thinking about Vernestra Rwoh when she interacts with her, being like, Lula Talasola at one point was thinking that she was like top of her class and she was one of those Padawans who's one to watch. And then she interacts with Vernestra Rwoh, who's only a couple years older than her, who already has a Padawan and seems to have her stuff together. And so it's always interesting, that perspective, because I think something that doesn't really get spoken about very much, although it's getting spoken about a lot more in Star Wars, it's not like a giant, massive social issue, so I understand why there's no specific spotlight on it, but it's that kind of thing of when you are a child who's recognised at being gifted at a young age, and then this huge amount of pressure is put on you to achieve high for your entire life. Like when I was in primary school, so when I was between the age of like 5 and 10, for anyone who's outside of England, I did quite well. I was top of the class-ish in a lot of subjects. Maths has always been something that came quite naturally for me. And so when I went to secondary school, it was then the expectation was me to be top of the class again. And although I did quite well in secondary school in a lot of ways, some people go one of two ways. And I've got friends who are also in a similar boat. Either you end up having to work yourself ragged and achieve those high things at no matter what the cost is, just so you don't disappoint people, or you kind of do what I ended up doing a little bit, which is becoming a little bit complacent, maybe a little bit lazy, thinking that you can just do everything without really having to try that hard. And I think that it's something that young people really need to be told about, and how obviously when adults interact with younger people who are seen as gifted or intelligent or ahead of the curve or anything, they still need to give them that space to be like, you are still young. Like we hope you'll do these great things, and somewhat we do expect them from you, but if you don't achieve them, that isn't your whole identity. And I think that's how Vernestra Rwoh's written very cleverly, where she's trying to struggle with being this incredible Jedi, but also her number one priority now is teaching Imri Kantaros how to be a good Jedi. Her job is to prepare him for the world. So I think it's that kind of, in my mind, it's almost like when someone who's quite young has a kid, and maybe they didn't plan for it to happen, but they're happy to go ahead with it. And then they have the kid when they're only really just barely an adult themselves. And that forces people to grow up and to look inward at oneself in certain ways. So I think that Vernestra really works well as a balance for Silvestri Yarrow, because when Silvestri communicates with Vernestra and they interact and things, Silvestri's entire world is in disarray. She's completely in chaos and she doesn't know what to do. Obviously, she has to have money to be able to live and things, whereas Vernestra is a bit more sheltered. She doesn't need money because she's part of the Jedi Order. You get all your food and your lodgings and everything prepared for you. But she's struggling in a different way with her spirituality, with her own maturity, with having to teach Imri loads of different elements, plus trying to deal with the Nile and the Drengir and all the other things that are going around in this era. So I think those two characters really balance each other out. So we've got Imri Kantaros, and he is one of my favourite young Jedi because he has a power which makes him an incredible empath. So Jedi, as you should know, in most Star Wars, there's moments where like a line gets spoken, Vader does it, I can sense your fear, or Obi-Wan does it in the prequels, it's like, I can sense your frustration, or I can tell you're tense, or all these sorts of things, or you can kind of tell people's mood. Now, that is a skill that certain Jedi have stronger than others, but Imri Kantaros seems to have the strongest empathetic force powers that anyone has seen in centuries. It's basically like he is a stronger empath than even Jedi Masters who have spent years, if not decades, practicing the form. And he's just a teenager, and he can tell someone's emotion beyond anyone. He can immediately tell basically what someone's thoughts are almost. He can't fully read their thoughts, but he can read the vibe very quickly. And so there's quite a few moments where certain characters interact, and you see that Imri, stirs or walks away from the situation or is a little bit uncomfortable, and then the certain characters leave, and then Vern's like, are you okay? And he's like, that person felt like this, and it was really hard to deal with, because he feels that emotion. If someone is near him feeling sad, he then feels sad. I mean, that is a weight to bear on anyone of any age, let alone having a teenager trying to find their own way in the world while trying to make their master happy, who's only a couple years older than them, while trying to deal with all these Jedi crises as well. That's another element of the coming of age part of the story, which obviously young adult books are specifically not quite meant for. There's other uses for them, but one of the key elements of a young adult book is the coming of age part, is people finding themselves. And just these three characters I've listed, they work so well because they're all a slightly different perspective of what it's like growing up. And that's just a testament to Justina Ireland, because in A Test of Courage, it is a very, very similar thing to that. And obviously she wrote both these books. And although I really like Claudia Gray's Into the Dark, and the characters in that are very interesting, I feel like this book specifically has better character journeys and more intriguing characters for me in that sort of coming of age time frame, the kind of, young adults and teenagers. And with linking into Claudia Gray, we've then got Reath Silas, or Reath Silas. Now, Reath is a character who's introduced in Into the Dark, and this is now going to be some spoilers for Into the Dark. Once again, I did a book review on that, go check it out. He basically lost his master in the Great Disaster, which was the event of Light of the Jedi, and he was lost for a little while, but then he found Master Comac, who's one of the people he was doing an adventure with in Into the Dark when kind of everything went bad. And some of the interactions he has with Vern are very interesting, because he trained with Vern as younglings. So when they were, children before they became Padawans and got adopted by a master, then when they were learning a lot of stuff, they were in a lot of the same classes. And Reath does have a degree of feelings to her. He kind of fancies her and stuff. And Imri can tell that whenever they interact, which is quite an entertaining thing when you've got Imri's kind of in the middle, like, this guy really fancies my master, but we're Jedi, we're not meant to talk about these things. And also it's kind of embarrassing, but I can kind of sense this strange tension there. And Reath is trying to not address that and trying to, push it down, because he's like, I'm a Jedi, I've got other things to think about, instead of how, beautiful Vern looks when she turns around and how her hair gently drapes against her cheekbones and things. And it's just those sort of little comments. And I like it when you've got some of these Jedi and they kind of fancy each other. And it's that thing of, oh my, look at the nape of their neck. Oh no, I shouldn't be thinking about those things. Anyway, on with the mission. They're just minor inner monologue sort of parts. I know I keep saying inner monologue, inner thoughts. So I like that interaction with Reath, and I also like it that he is one of the few characters who doesn't seem to negatively compare himself to Vernestra Rwoh. He is not someone who looks at Vern with any animosity or any jealousy. He just looks at her in admiration. And I really like that, because it's someone who bolsters her up a little bit, even though she doesn't necessarily know that, but he really respects her. And also there's a character in this which pops up again called Nan. Now Nan is a Nihil who's around the same sort of age as Reath, and they interacted Into the Dark. Reath didn't know she was a Nihil, and then towards the end it's become apparent that she was manipulating him and all that sort of thing. So Nan appears again in this story, and Nan does actually appear again in Fallen Star. She has quite a more of a major role in Fallen Star, which is the Claudia Gray book, the third adult novel, the kind of finale to the first phase of the High Republic. And Reath is definitely more of a secondary or even tertiary character. He is in quite a few chapters in this, and he does interact with Vern and Imri and things, but whenever Vern is in a chapter or in part of the story, Reath is always slightly more in the background. So then we move on to someone who I wrote down initially as Mysterious Woman until we got their character name, which is Jordana Sparkburn. And surname of Sparkburn. Is there a more Star Warsy name? So they are a deputy sheriff for the San Tekkas. She has been fighting the Nihil and Raiders and the Drengir and things on this planet that she's on, which is Tikai, Tiikae. And she's quite a strong character, she doesn't take nothing from anyone sort of thing. She's kind of a gunslinger in certain ways. She uses violence in certain ways. She's not sadistic, but because she spent so many years fighting off Raiders and Drengir and the Nihil and things from her homestead, she can't really catch a break. Because of that, she's quite hardened. And she's a really interesting character, and some of the interactions she has with Silvestri are really cool too. I won't delve into them quite yet, that'll be more so towards the end, but the way she interacts with Silvestri and the way she interacts with other Jedi and things, and the way she interacts with the Grafs is interesting as well, because she is hired by the San Tekkas, and the San Tekkas and the Grafs have a competitive relationship because they're the two big families to do hyperspace and whatnot. And Jordana actually has a pet familiar. Well, I say pet, that kind of downplays the animal. But the animal is called a Volka, Vollka. And it's basically, the way I describe it is an electro tiger. Apparently the Volka is over 100 years old. It's been in Jordana's family for quite a long time, and it's a ferocious beast. They can kind of go invisible, or potentially they move super quickly. You're never fully told in this book. It's kind of alluded to, and there's a couple of comments, and Reath makes he mentions a rumor about them, and Jordana's like, no, that doesn't happen. And then the next scene, something very similar to that happens. So it's kind of is it invisible? Is it not? But it's basically this ultimate hunter. It's a tiger that, is electric in certain ways and can be very ferocious. And Imri, the whole book, Imri is trying to connect with this Volka, is trying to pet this beautiful feline. And the Volker initially is kind of resistant to it, but because obviously Imri is such an empath, he can kind of read the vibes a little bit. There's one moment where he thinks that the Volker's okay, and it's not, and he almost gets his face swiped. But aside from that, it's quite nice seeing Imri interact with the Volker, as well as, Jordana interacting with her own pet familiar. So then we move on to Zylan Graf. So Zylan Graf, his family is responsible for many of the hyperspace lanes, as they are hyperspace prospectors, much like Lor San Tekka. And the jobs for these families, more so hundreds of years ago when the Republic was kind of venturing out into the Outer Rim and that sort of thing. I'm sure that as we go back in the timeline of Star Wars, we're going to get more concrete information and lore about how hyperspace was discovered in a way. I've got quite a few notes about hyperspace, but I am going to save those for when I do the spoilery part of this, because a lot of them are quite interesting parts that are sprinkled across the book, and I wouldn't want you guys to have that spoiled for you unless you specifically aren't going to read the book. And the reason that Xylan Graf is involved in this is because what seems to have happened is Silvestri Yarrow, her ship got pulled out of hyperspace. And that's how all these events kind of occur and whatnot. And Xylan Graf wants to know exactly how that was even possible, because someone who is a hyperspace prospector and whose family makes money off hyperspace, they want to know if there's a weapon that can potentially compromise their entire travel system of the galaxy. So he wants to get involved because when he hears what happens to Silvestri, he basically offers her like a huge amount of money and a brand new ship and all kinds of other things if he can help her and find out more information about this, which is that kind of struggle that Silvestri goes through, because she's kind of like, well, I don't want to help this guy, but equally he's got stuff I want and it will make my life infinitely easier after I help him with this stuff if I get this money. Which I think is also a part that is a lesson to be learned for people, because it happens in England, it happens in the Western world, but from what I understand about America, a lot of it is that working ethic, is that thing of, you have to work as much as physically possible to be able to make money. We're in the capitalist society, and I want to clarify, I've got no problem with capitalist society, but it's that kind of pull yourself up by the bootstraps. If you work hard, you will be rewarded by it, and if you just keep on putting in the hours, eventually you will get the payoff. And I think the story in this book is trying to allude to saying you could invest all your time and all your effort and everything into this plan that seems to be something that will make you rich at the end of it, or will finally have you settled and these sort of things. But things don't go to plan, and it's rarely that simple. A lot of the time when you get the kind of people who are so rich that they don't know what to do with their money, they're often born into it, or they're in a very unique situation. I kind of compare Xylan Graf almost to an oil baron's son, where he doesn't necessarily really do that much for the company. He kind of does quite a lot of busy work and then reaps all of the benefits of being in a really wealthy family. And he does kind of view himself as better than most people, and he has to be taken down a peg, but it kind of depends on what is going to take him down, in a sense. He's not an explicitly bad person necessarily. He's just not a good person. I think he manipulates people quite a lot because he can, and that's kind of what he's always done. So really, that's an overview of the main characters. I'm not going to delve into all the side characters and all that sort of stuff because I will be here all day, and you just want, a general idea of what these characters are and the themes within it. So I think I've given you guys quite a good idea of this kind of mild spoilery thoughts on the story in the book itself, of the themes and the characters and how they sort of interact with each other. And that should give you guys a good idea on the book. So I will say that from here now, I'm going to get into slightly more spoiler territory. So I'm going to now read out some of the notes I have just about hyperspace. So this is kind of the bridging the gap thing. So if you are okay to hear about some of the tidbits about hyperspace and some of the little notes that I've got that don't impact the wider story, then you've still got a few minutes before I delve into the spoilery elements of this review. And then after that, I'll give you fair warning, and then I'll just kind of run through the general storyline of this book, just in case anyone listening isn't going to pick it up. So some of the notes I've got here, one of them is that hyperspace usage needs beacons with older nav computers. 1 beacon is dangerous, 3 is more ideal. So I don't think this is the case in modern day Star Wars. Saying modern day is referring to the Skywalker saga, which obviously is over like 60 odd years, but still. Before the computer systems and astromechs and things on a ship were powerful enough to generate their own paths through the hyperspace, they needed beacons to kind of latch onto. And then when you latch onto one beacon, then it helps guide you through hyperspace. And, hyperspace lane and the paths one can use to use hyperspace is basically a way to travel faster than light speed, and there should be no obstacles in the way. There shouldn't be any comets that are going to go in the way. There shouldn't be any space debris. There shouldn't be any planets. So the idea is that if you kind of aim at the right angle and just go super fast in, generally speaking, one direction, then if the map has been planned out in the right way, you won't hit anything and you'll get somewhere really, really fast. And in the older times, one needs to have beacons to assist with those, because if you've only got one, then you haven't got a good idea of some of the debris around you. That's generally how it is. So I quite like that idea from the older elements of hyperspace, because they're the kind of things I think are going to be delved into with the second phase of the High Republic, which is set 150 years before the first phase. And then jumping off of that, I've got more information, which is hyperspace prospecting. Now, at present in the High Republic, people are unsure of the nature of the hyperspace lanes. Some say that they are navigatable wormholes. Others say that they were routes carved out by a giant race that no longer exists. like an ancient giant race of beings that don't exist anymore. And I wonder if that is linking into the giant space whale things that we saw in Star Wars Rebels. Now, if you don't know what I'm talking about, then go watch Star Wars Rebels because it's incredible. If you do know what I'm talking about, then you know what I'm talking about. I'm not going to have to delve into that anymore. But I feel like that was maybe a nod to those. But it's quite interesting thinking about like parts of space being carved out by an ancient being. I just think that's such an interesting idea. And I like how there's this mystery around hyperspace where even you've got the Graphs and the Santekers who do a lot of hyperspace prospecting and they aren't even necessarily sure what's caused all this. So they're not the ones who go out and make the hyperspace lanes. They just go out and discover them. They're already there. So that's a very interesting element to me as well, which kind of, I think once again, this is a social commentary, kind of a nod to a lot of these big corporations who kind of just stumble into, say, oil or other naturally occurring things on Earth. And they're like, oh, cool, we found this. We're just going to utilize it, basically put a fence around it and then sell it to the rest of the world because it's imperative to use. And I have a feeling that's kind of, I may be misinterpreting or overinterpreting things, but I feel like that's the kind of on-the-nose thing that Justina Ireland's going for, where it's just like, yeah, they don't even know how these things exist, but they're the ones selling them. And I quite like that element. So then we move on to the Niles hyperspace weapon, which is called the Gravity's Heart. It pulls ships out of hyperspace. It was created by a scientist who knew a lot about theory and physics and whatnot, about how hyperspace works and how the ship's hyperspace engines or hyperdrives, how they work as well. And it's just quite an interesting thing because in The Last Jedi, you don't get pulled out of hyperspace, but the First Order had a way to follow ships through hyperspace. And as of yet in the canon, I don't think there's been a weapon that can pull people out of hyperspace, and I wonder if the further back we go, especially to the earlier days of when hyperspace was used, if that will be a more common thing, because at the point here, it sounds like nothing like this has been made before. But also, 200 years after these events, you get to the Skywalker saga, and barely anyone knows anything about like Starlight Beacon, or a lot of these things aren't mentioned. And I mean, you know, in universe, I'm speaking about this. And if we think about, 200 years ago, if we think about the early 1800s, even though we've got a lot of written records and a lot of information about history, we don't necessarily know everything. We don't have the specific ideas of the minutiae of what goes on standard everyday life. For a lot of civilizations and a lot of people, we do. There's things like how people used to churn butter and what life was like before electricity and all those sorts of things, because obviously electricity was primarily around the 1900s. So I understand that we've got information, but if you think of how much information there was 200 years ago about how people were living and how much we know about that now, and about how much today is interpreted by historians or recovered from certain documents and put together and things, I do wonder how much of it gets lost. And I think that connects with this as well. It's like, we're going to see with the High Republic 150 years prior, there are obviously in Star Wars some individuals who are alive, 150 years, 200 years ago. One of them is going to be obviously Yoda, because he's alive, he's like 900 when he dies in Return of the Jedi. You've got Porter Engle, who at the point of Out of the Shadows and things, he's like around 300 years old. You've got Yariel Poof, I think he's a couple hundred years old as well. And you've got Obra Tuck, who's in the High Republic Adventures comics that I tackled, I think, last week. He's like 1,000 years old. You got Maz Kanata, she's like 1,000. So you've got certain characters who have literally lived through it all, but they can only explain their experience through a very narrow lens. And because quite a lot of them are Jedi, they also have quite a different perspective on life as to what the standard person may have. So I'm very intrigued to see 150 years prior to this, when most people who are alive in this phase weren't alive 150 years ago. I'm intrigued to see how the High Republic was different then, and I'm definitely intrigued to see how it goes sort of further behind that. And then there's another element here, which is Vernestra has hyperspace visions. And this is something which Padawans have had on the odd occasion, but it's something that I believe Timothy Zahn has gone into in his Thrawn books. So not talking about the Legends ones, Heir to the Empire, talking about the canon ones. There's the two trilogies. There's the standard Thrawn trilogy, that's Thrawn, Thrawn Alliances and Thrawn Treason. And then there's the Thrawn Ascendancy trilogy. And with the Ascendancy trilogy, it goes into the lore and the depth of the Chiss, which is the species that Grand Admiral Thrawn is. Thrawn is an antagonist in Star Wars Rebels. That's how people who appreciate the canon would know him the most. Whereas, most people who've read Legends books know that he was the first big bad after Return of the Jedi in a way, because the Heir to the Empire trilogy of books was considered the sequel saga when it was released in, I believe, the early 90s. But Thrawn was the big bad then, and then him coming into canon, and obviously anyone who's been watching like The Mandalorian, for example, example, Thrawn's name gets dropped there. So there's lots of threads that are leading into Thrawn being a big bad once again. We don't know in what capacity. It's probably going to be like a soft remake of the Heir to the Empire trilogy, but with all these live action shows and stuff. But the reason I mention him anyway is because the Chiss, I believe they call them the Skywalkers, which is obviously an on the nose thing, which is young, I believe primarily women. When they are of sort of teenage sort of age, they help control the Chiss ships go through hyperspace. So they can basically navigate through hyperspace using the Force. They don't call it the Force, they call it something else. But Vernestra Rwoh's visions, for me, seems to link in quite a lot with the Chiss Skywalkers who can navigate through hyperspace. It's not quite the same thing because Vernestra can't necessarily navigate through hyperspace, but being in hyperspace in a ship and seeing all those blue lights go around her, it seems to trigger some Force visions. It's something she had a lot when she was a younger Padawan, when she was being trained by Stellan Gios, and it gets brought up at one point because she does have an interaction with Stellan Gios, who is one of the main characters in the adult novels of this phase of the High Republic. But it's something that she felt like she grew out of. And then in this, she has them again, and they are very vivid. And when she's had these visions and things, she is initially quite resistant to listen to them and pay attention to them. She doesn't like them. They're quite invasive. A lot of the time when a Jedi wants to have a vision, a lot of the time they have to sit, they meditate, and then it will come to them. Whereas, Vern just doing stuff in hyperspace and then a vision hitting her, that can be quite difficult to take, and especially because her visions are so vivid, and then as the story starts to unfold, you kind of see that some of these visions were coming true, and they play quite an important role in how the story plays out. So that's another element as well, is like, traveling through hyperspace could be considered quite a Force-related activity. And given these beings that I mentioned in, I think they're called the Purgil, which mentioned in Star Wars Rebels, these whale things that can travel through hyperspace, they seem to be, Force beings. And I can't remember if it's in this book or if it's another one of the Star Wars High Republic books I read, but there's some sort of mention somewhere about traveling through hyperspace being like a Force ability in some ways. So if there are beings that can travel through hyperspace, in theory, could there be Jedi or Sith who could be on a ship that doesn't have a hyperspace drive, or hyperdrive, and then they could use the Force and maybe travel through hyperspace? Is that potentially how hyperspace first started happening? So that's a very intriguing thread that I'd love to hear about. As you can tell, I'm a massive nerd for the lore of Star Wars, including hyperspace. I could talk about hyperspace all day. I love it. It's very intriguing. But those are sort of the main elements of this book that are still teetering on spoilers. They're not specific spoilers because a lot of these notes I made were on like a couple of throwaway lines, mainly if Zylan Graf is talking to the Santekers or other people are talking to either the Grafs or the Santekers, hearing about these things. So this is now going to be we're getting into the final part of this review, and it's less now of a review because I've given you guys plenty of my thoughts. I'm now just going to generally run through the story, and then we'll kind of wrap up and we'll finish this. So this is your guys' warning of if you want to pick up Out of the Shadows, which I really recommend, and if you want to read it and things, then, and you want to go in with that knowing relatively everything that happens, then here's your warning. But on the same token, you can still listen to what I have to say, and if you do pick up the book, there's still so many great things. There's tons of amazing dialogue in this. There's a handful of characters I've not even mentioned. There's a Gungan in this who I think is really interesting, and he completely goes against the stereotype laid by Jar Jar Binks. And obviously at this point in the timeline, Jar Jar doesn't exist, but he kind of goes against the grain of what one believes a Gungan is. And I believe in Daniel Jose Older's Last Shot book, I think it's the same thing. So, trying to get through the stereotypes that Gungans are all bumbling idiots. But anyway, so let's get into some of the story. So early on in this review, I did confirm how the story kind of gets started. Silvestri has her ship stolen, and then she tries to get another one. She ends up doing a deal with Zylan Graf to try and find out about being pulled out of hyperspace. And I mentioned that there was a scientist who created the hyperspace weapon, the Gravity's Heart. Now this is quite major spoilers. It gets announced probably about a third through the book, but for someone who's not picked up the book, this is now going to be major spoilers. So there's your warning. When I said Silvestri Yarrow's mum was dead, she is thought to be dead for the first third of the book or so, but then you get a chapter from Silvestri's mum's perspective, and her name is Chauncey Yarrow. She's actually interacting with the Nile I mentioned prior, Nan, who appeared in Into the Dark. And both Chauncey Yarrow and also Nan both appear in the Fallen Star book set after this. Now, Chauncey is actually working for the Nile because she has an incredible knowledge of physics and things. And when she was in, I believe, like college or something like that, people wouldn't listen to her ideas about hyperspace and how you could manipulate it and how weapons could be made and things. And because no one believed her, she kind of got shunned by her peers and her superiors and things, and then she eventually found the Nile, and then they were like, oh, you want to make a hyperspace weapon? That's great. Here, we'll give you resources. You can kind of do what you want. Here you go. So she's off making this hyperspace weapon, which is how Silvestri's path is so intertwined in this, because it starts off just being like, oh, she got pulled out of hyperspace. I wonder how. Let's find out more information. And then when you find out before Silvestri does that her own mum is the cause of this, then it all kind of untangles, especially when Silvestri finds out and she interacts with her mum, who she thought had been dead for several years. It's really interesting. It's very emotional stuff. But basically, Silvestri ends up meeting with Senator Gia Staros. Gia Staros is Avon Staros' mum. Avon Staros is one of the characters in A Test of Courage. And Gia Staros she's a senator, and she wants Silvestri and some Jedi to go and find out what's going on with these ships being pulled out of hyperspace, because they seem to be happening in a certain area. It's happening quite a lot. So she wants someone to go out there and investigate. Xylan Graf wants to go to prove that it's impossible and that there's nothing wrong with hyperspace. And then once they can confirm that, then the Grafs can buy this area that they want to build hyperspace lanes through or something like that. And the Sandtekers are also gunning for that area. So Graf is trying to prove that this area is safe so he can then do stuff in it for his family and make the family more money, whereas Gia Staros doesn't want them to do that because she knows that if the Grafs go over there, they're just going to do one of those tests. It's going to be a really vague test, or they're not going to be truthful about the results. So she insists that Vernestra and Imri Kantaros go along with Xylan, and Xylan has also got Silvestri with him at the time because, you know, they made that deal and things. So that's how the gang end up having to go to this area and find out more information and eventually interact with the Nile and things. And in addition to Vern and Imri being attached to this, Reith, Silas, and Master Comac, Vitus, also get attached to it. So you've then got 4 Force users, 2 Jedi, 2 Padawans, along with Silvestri Yarrow and Xylan Graf. And then Jordana Sparkburn, the way she comes into it, I can't remember exactly how. I think they go to her homeworld or something along those lines. But she has a history with Silvestri Yarrow. They actually used to date. And they were very much in love at one point. But Silvestri Yarrow basically said, I need to leave this planet that we're on. I need to go out and do more with my life. And because Jordana was quite comfortable being the deputy of the planet, she wanted to stay, so they split up. And it wasn't the most pleasant of breakups. Both of them were upset and hurt by that, and you get a lot of this relationship tension between Silvestri and Jordana, which I really like as well. I think it adds just more weight to the characters and makes them feel like real people. And in addition to all of these things, you get a bit more information about the Oracle, who is the Sandteker woman who was thought to have disappeared ages ago, and the Sandtekers have just stopped looking for her. She's the reason that the Nile can use paths, which is their unique way of hyperspace travel. So you get a bit more information about her and Nan, as well as Silvestri having to look after her, and this Oracle can see all hyperspace routes, all through time, all at the same time. She has like the strength of apparently like 10,000 computers. And the reason that the paths work as opposed to hyperspace lanes is because a hyperspace lane is meant to be something that is kind of permanent. So as an example, if you went from one planet to another, just a straight line, and there was nothing in between, you're fairly confident, unless there's some sort of massive meteor storm or something like that, you could safely go from point A to point B constantly. Whereas the paths show that there's a lot of hyperspace paths you can go down, but only temporarily. So when certain planets are in certain levels of orbit around their respective suns, you could then shoot faster than hyperspace between these two planets and get from point A to point B going through that area. Whereas if you did that in, say, a month's time, the planets would have shifted and then it may not be safe to do so. So that's kind of how the paths work with the Oracle. She can just see all the time how one could travel through hyperspace, and that's how the Nile managed to do it. And then I'm just going to reel through some of my notes of the story. All these people, after speaking with Gia Staros and stuff, they all head to the Graf's place. So the Graf's place is very luxurious, it's very expensive, all those things, and it's kind of that part I mentioned where it's like comparing the rich and the excessive and the overly extravagant to the more simplistic, almost monk-like way that the Jedi live. And obviously people like Silvestri and Jordana don't have the comfort of the Jedi Order, but they know the value of money, and they don't have very much of it. So when they go to the Graf's place, it's even more astonishing. And I want to clarify, I'm skipping through quite a few chunks here just because I don't want to just reel off the entire story because I'll be here all day. So then Sil eventually meets Chansey Yarrow. They meet on the hyperspace weapon. Chansey wants to protect Sil and wants Sil to join her. Sil refuses. And after like a bit of tussling and things, Chansey, Sil and Nan end up in the Oracle's room. And Sil's like, what on earth is all this? Meanwhile, Vernestra, Rwoh, as well as Jordana and Master Comac go to try and rescue them. Then Vern meets the Oracle, and the Oracle tells Vern about a special path and confirms like some information to Vern that she wouldn't have known otherwise, and it connects with Vern's visions in hyperspace. Some Nile reinforcements then show up, so Chansey then runs away, the rest of the gang manage to escape, and Vern then goes to a council meeting, I believe via comms, and they all confirm they believe that Lorna D is the eye of the Nile. The Graphs then also confirm this, they also believe that's the case, but the Graphs have got their own agendas and things, so you can't always take what they're saying to be true. And Vern then tells Imri about the path that the Oracle told her about, and she didn't actually tell the council about that, and Stellan Gios, her old master, he's on the council, so there are certain elements that Vern doesn't actually want to share with the rest of the Jedi Order. So Sil is given a ship by Xylan Graf, and he also gives her this token, which is meant to be given to Mars Kanata at Takodana, which I'm quite intrigued by. I want to know way more about Mars. I want to know about her life, but I feel like if we found out all about her life, it would give away a lot of how the universe is at the time. So I'm hoping that every era of Star Wars we get, as it goes back by a few hundred years each time, we get at least one Mars Kanata story, because she's very intriguing to me. And I didn't explain it very well just then, but basically the whole kind of big battle-y stuff, the action set pieces towards the end of this book is when they find out what the cause of the hyperspace, being pulled out of hyperspace was. It's that weapon I mentioned, the Gravity's Heart. So they all go there to investigate and stuff, and that's when there's like some fighting with the Nile, and then they get locked up, and then they escape, and all these sort of things. That was generally what I was alluding to earlier. I didn't really explain it very well, but, action scenes, especially in these reviews and things, I generally just kind of skirt over, because they're the kind of bits that you would get the most enjoyment from reading yourself. Kind of final beats of this book show that Nan and Chansey go to the Graphs, and it confirms that it was their plan to get the Oracle, because Nan and Chansey wanted to get the Oracle for the Graphs, so the Graphs have got this Santeca who can see the whole galaxy's hyperspace lanes all the time and things, and it was all planned a very long time ago, and the Graphs, as well as Chansey, are working with Lorna D. Now, Lorna D, although it says that the Jedi Council believe that she is the Eye of the Nile, obviously she's not, it's Marchion Rwoh, Lorna D is actually like an auntie to Silvestri Yarrow, because Lorna D has known Chansey for a long period of time, and Lorna D actually taught Silvestri how to fight when she was younger for a little bit, and Silvestri just didn't put two and two together until it was laid out bare for by Chansey. So Silvestri's life has been somewhat intertwined with the Nile to varying degrees, depending on what perspective you look at it. And if you know anything about what Lorna D is doing with Marchion Rwoh and the Nile through there's the Tempest Runner audio drama, which is the script book has now been released for that, but I listened to the audio drama of that, which is by Kevin Scott, as well as, the standard High Republic books, but the Marvel comics, also by Kevin Scott, there's 15 of them. You get, especially for the last volume of those, you get a bit more information of Lorna D and her sort of interactions with Marchion Rwoh and her relationship with him, and how she views the Nile and how she views her place in it, because this shows that she's got some sort of contingency plan that when or if the Nile fall, then she's got something with the Graphs and with Chansey and things to be able to escape, maybe utilizing the Oracle. You don't know explicitly what the plan is, but it seems like a lot of this book is basically showing that Chansey was developing a hyperspace weapon, Lorna D and the Graphs were planning and plotting against the Nile to try and get the Oracle to revolutionize how they interact with hyperspace lanes and whatnot. This is all happening while Vernestra, Rwoh, Imri, Reith and Master Comac are basically being told to follow this somewhat of a wild goose chase while there's far more pressing matters going on across the galaxy, for the Jedi especially, and them kind of questioning why they're being called to this and why Giastaros has got the power to be able to command some Jedi to go on this mission, why the Graphs are so intrigued by this plot. So a lot of it is just, why is this like this? It's a lot of conspiracy, it's a lot of characters finding themselves. This is why I said earlier on in my review, although I think this is a really good book and I love the characters in it, the plot in itself is a bit convoluted and doesn't necessarily seem to be like a full story, if you know what I mean. Like, it is. I don't want to downplay. If Justina Ireland is listening, I'm very sorry. I love the book. But it was more so that, with some of the other books, including like A Test of Courage, you've got a clear start, middle and end, and by the end of it, you kind of know where you stand. Whereas this one kind of felt like it was the middle book of a trilogy. And I know technically speaking, I guess it is, because it's the second young adult book, Into the Dark, then this, and Midnight Horizon. And I've not read Midnight Horizon, so I don't know what happens in it yet. I'm going to read that once I finish Fallen Star, and once I've then read Mission to Disaster, I'll move on to Midnight Horizon. So maybe once I've read Midnight Horizon, my review will potentially make this book somewhat better. But I just found that reading this book, it kind of ended, and from the last third or so, I liked some of the closure some of the characters got, and I liked some of the lore information we got, but it didn't really seem to answer that many questions. It was like, oh, here's a conspiracy that starts at the start of this book, and then, oh, it turns out the conspiracy was done by these people. And you go, okay, why? Oh, to get the Oracle. Oh, why? Oh, you don't know yet. Okay. And that's kind of it. It's like, right? Okay. And that's kind of a little bit how I felt. That's the only part of this book I'd say is slightly weaker than some of the other High Republic books, is just this book is not necessarily one for an incredible story. It's one where the characters and the journeys they go on is much more intriguing, and as I said, the dialogue is really, really good between the characters. These people feel so human, so real as individuals, which is one of the elements I really like. And maybe that's one of the reasons why the story isn't quite as interesting. It hasn't got these space wizards fighting off evil with glowing laser swords. It's not all about that. It's not that simple. It's a lot more complex, and it's much more of a grounded storyline in some ways, if you know what I'm kind of getting at. But I think that's pretty much where I'll leave this. I have been talking for over an hour now, and I just want to kind of share my thoughts about this with you guys, and so that you could hear what I think about the book in itself, but also you get some information about it. If this is going to be one of those books that you kind of skip over, and one of the books that you want to, you don't have time to read it or any of those things, because there is a lot of High Republic content, but you want to know about Vernestra, Rwoh, Imri Kantaros, or anything like that, then you still get that information from me. So, I want to say thank you guys for listening to this. I do very much appreciate it, especially you guys listening all the way to the end when it's the spoilery stuff. But just a couple of things before I let you go. So first of all, it's going to be, check out my other High Republic content. So if you're listening on YouTube, then there's playlists for High Republic, both the comics as well as the books. There's also a separate book review playlist as well, so you can listen on there. The next book review I'm going to be doing is going to be Fallen Star, which is the third wave book, which I'm very excited to do. I'm just over halfway reading through that at present, and it's going to be quite high up on my priority list. I've got a couple of other things I need to read as well that are coming up, including what the next comics and stuff I'm going to be doing. But my goal is to have all High Republic content tackled on this show before we start the second phase of the High Republic set 150 years prior. Otherwise, it's going to get very complicated for people trying to read books that are 150 years prior while I'm tackling stuff that's in, 150 years on from that. So, make sure you check out the stuff on YouTube. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel if you haven't already. I'm trying to get to 100 subscribers so I can then change the channel link name and stuff. So that would be really, really handy if you guys could do that. If you could also, share on social media, rate and review. If you're listening on a podcast app, you can rate Comics in Motion. If you're listening on YouTube, you can write a comment or just like it or do any of those sort of things. It helps the show out, and you can spread the word, with anyone that you think may enjoy this. If they're High Republic readers, if they've already read this book, what do they think compared to what I've said? Did they pick up on some of the things I mentioned about Hyperspace? I'd always be interested to hear your guys' opinions and thoughts on this book and any of the other High Republic content I've tackled, or really any Star Wars content. I'm always intrigued to open up a dialogue with people, as long as everyone's being, respectful of each other's beliefs, which for the most part they are. For most people I've interacted with from me launching this podcast have been delightful. And in addition to that, if you want to get access to some additional content, you get early access to certain Star Wars things I release. You'll get exclusive access to some of the book reviews I've done, which are not High Republic. So Last Shot, Dark Disciple, the Legends book Shatterpoint, the Legends book Darth Plagueis, as well as I'm listening to A New Dawn at the moment, which is the Star Wars Rebels prequel book about Hera Syndulla and Kanan Jarrus. So I'm doing those at the moment. I think I'm planning on doing the Darth Bane trilogy next, but because they're Legends, obviously, some of them are Legends, so I'm keeping them on the Patreon, and the other books, which I don't want to do a full hour and a half long review on them. I just kind of flick the recorder on and just chat for like 20 minutes or so. So it's, not as structured as these are, but I still keep the general same format of keeping it spoiler free to begin with, and then I delve into spoilery topics. So if you want to get access to exclusive Star Wars book reviews, early access to content, and then you also get access to at least one episode of Afterthoughts every week that me and Megan do. If you want a taster on to see what mine and Megan's Afterthoughts are like, you can go to bit.ly/TomHanks1 and you get access to the first of the Tom Hanks rewatch that me and Megan have been doing. We tackled the film Big, which Megan had never seen before. So if you want to hear us talking about that, and that's the first of our Tom Hanks watch over 2022. So we've watched Big, Turner and Hooch, Joe versus the Volcano, The Burbs. We got A League of Their Own next, Sleepless in Seattle, Philadelphia, Forrest Gump. So Tom Hanks has been in a lot of movies, so we're trying to tackle like a huge amount of them, not every single one. I think Megan wants to not watch Polar Express because she despises that movie. And we did start with Big, even though Tom Hanks was in a few films before that. But still, if you want to hear me and Megan go through those, if you want to hear our spoiler-free thoughts on some of the new movies that are out, like there's the Batman, we've done spoiler-free review on that. Some of the Marvel Cinematic Universe stuff, like we did one for the Eternals when that came out. We haven't done one for No Way Home, which I'm just realising now, but I think we're going to rewatch that soon, because Megan wants to rewatch Spider-Man 3, and then Amazing Spider-Man 2, and then No Way Home again. So we'll probably do some sort of big review on that as well. But yeah, there's spoiler-free stuff on there. We talk about TV series. We did one about the Book of Mormon. We're doing it on the Tom Hanks movies. We're doing it on other random movies we watch. So there's all of those things that we release, at least one of those a week, plus you get access to my afterthoughts on comics. So I did a couple of Batman ones, plus my exclusive book reviews on there, loads of different things, and you can get access to all of that for as little as £1 a month. And that means you get access to the audio exclusive feed that you can just pop into the podcasting app of your choice, and then you get access to the genuine Chit-Chat exclusive Patreon feed. And you have access to that because the logo for it is the same as the standard genuine Chit-Chat logo, but the word genuine is in gold as opposed to silver. I mean, that's what your money is going towards. Well, obviously, it also helps the show out. It helps me afford these books that I buy and the comics and the time I spend, etc. So if you're willing to contribute to the show financially, that would be delightful. But if you can't, then please subscribe on YouTube, share on social media, talk about this with your friends, and give me any feedback. I would appreciate that hugely. Just the final things before I leave you guys is make sure you always check out the show notes. It's got information on when the releases for my other Star Wars High Republic content was out, especially the book reviews and things. Obviously on YouTube, you can find it in the playlists, or if you just type it into the podcast player of your choice, you just type in whatever the book is and book review. The search result comes up quite high on the book reviews that I have done, which is quite cool. But in addition, in the show notes, there are the guest spots that I've done recently. So on the feed of Comics in Motion, there is the Comics in Motion book club that I launched last year. And every few months we get together and tackle a group of comics, like a volume or something similar to that. We've done the first volume of Darth Vader comics. We've done the Art Spiegelman book Mouse. There was V for Vendetta that was done by Alan Moore. There was the first 8 comics in the Neil Gaiman Sandman run, which is the first volume, which is Preludes and Nocturnes, I think it's called. There's loads of different book club ideas that are floating around. So if you want to hear me on Sandman talking about my experience, because I'd never read Sandman before, if you want to hear about that, as well as many other friends of the show, both Genuine Chit-Chat and Comics in Motion, please make sure you check that out and share with your friends and that sort of stuff. And if you're listening to this on any podcast app, make sure you subscribe to Comics in Motion, because there are so many great shows that come out on there. Not just shows from me, but also shows from my wonderful Comics in Motion family. And there's plenty of collaborations that go on there as well. So if you're only listening for my voice, thank you very much. If you are only listening for me, then I do pop up in quite a few other bits and pieces here and there as well. So lots of reasons to subscribe to Comics in Motion. And then also in the description, there'll be my recent guest spot on Star Wars Timeline. I've been on Star Wars Timeline like 4 times before, so this is the 5th time. And we talk about accents in Star Wars. It's a very intriguing conversation that I had with Ben for about 2 hours. I think we're planning on doing another one at some point as well. But it was really, really good. I thoroughly enjoyed that. You guys would remember Ben because he was in a few of the Book of Boba Fett discussion shows. And also in Comics in Motion, there's going to be, I think, the Moon Knight discussion show that I think Scott Weatherly, he's going to be at the helm of. That's going to start towards the end of March when the first episode of Moon Knight drops. And then when the Kenobi episode drops on the 25th of May, I'm going to be doing a week-by-week Star Wars discussion show, much like I did with Book of Boba Fett as well. So lots of very exciting things all happening. But thank you as always for listening, guys. I appreciate each and every one of you listening all the way to the end of my rambles and my nonsense. And just thank you so much for listening. I haven't told you what I'm doing next week. In all honesty, I haven't figured it out. It's my birthday today as recording at this part because you guys are so important to me. I took the day off work and I've been eating sweets and Marmite biscuits and recording podcasts. And I haven't fully decided what I'm doing. I need to read all of the Trail of Shadows because I need to find out if the ending of that is going to spoil the end of The Fallen Star. I have a suspicion that it will, but I'll need to figure that out. So I may be doing Trail of Shadows next week, or I may just do Poe Dameron, like the next batch of Poe Dameron comics, because that might be a bit safer while I get through The Fallen Star. But I haven't really figured it out fully. There's obviously the other High Republic content that's coming out as well, but I'm currently waiting on delivery for the last few of the High Republic comics, so I'll need to work out what order I end up releasing some of these things in, and also I need to do the Crimson Reign comics as well, but that probably won't be next week, because that takes a lot of time to do those. But yeah, enough rambling for me. Thank you as always for listening, guys. I appreciate each and every one of you listening all the way to the end. I'll talk to you next Saturday with something. I'll figure it out. And also, as always, guys, may the Force be with you. The intro for Star Wars Comics and Canon is arranged by myself, Mike Burton, and the backing music was made by Eric Matias of soundimage.org.
You have just experienced host, creator, everything elser of Genuine Chit-Chat, and also the host and creator of Star Wars Comics and Canon, found on the Comics in Motion podcast, Mike Burton.